History remembers the great land battles, the storming of beaches, the clash of armies, but sometimes history forgets the sea and the men who vanished beneath it. May 22nd, 1941, a date that rarely appears on calendars of national remembrance, and yet it was one of the darkest single days for the Royal Navy in the entire Second World War. Not because it was a day of grand strategy or political turning points, but because it was a day when the Mediterranean Sea boiled with steel and fire, and British warships battered, isolated, overwhelmed, were hunted from the sky like wounded animals. In one brutal cycle of daylight, the pride of the Royal Navy in the Eastern Mediterranean was pushed to the very edge of destruction, not by another fleet, but by something it had not been built to fight. Overwhelming air power. It was the culmination of a silent shift in the balance of warfare from naval supremacy to aerial dominance, and it would change how navies fought forever. But the question still echoes, like the last SOS signals sent from burning decks, why were these warships left to die under open skies? And what did this sacrifice mean for the future of naval warfare? Let us return to the waters off Crete. On a day when the sea offered no shelter, and the sky no mercy. In May of 1941, Nazi Germany had already swept through much of Europe with breathtaking speed. Yugoslavia had fallen, Greece had been occupied, and now Adolf Hitler's gaze had shifted to the strategic island of Crete, a stepping stone across the eastern Mediterranean. Crete was more than just a rock in the sea. It offered command of naval routes to Egypt and the Suez Canal, lifeline of the British Empire. It also held airfields from which bombers could reach British supply lines in North Africa. But most of all, it was a symbol. If Britain could hold Crete after the fall of mainland Greece, it would send a message. The empire was not yet broken. If Germany took it, especially through paratrooper assault, it would mark the first time in history an island had been seized entirely from the air. The German High Command gave the operation a name, Unternehmen Merkur, Operation Mercury. The assault began on May 20th with a bold, all-airborne attack. Waves of Fallschirmjäger elite German paratroopers dropped across the island in a dramatic and chaotic battle. Resistance was fierce. Cretan partisans, local civilians, and British Commonwealth forces fought savagely to hold key airfields and towns, but what happened at sea was just as important and far more tragic. To support the land defense, the Royal Navy deployed the bulk of its Mediterranean fleet under Admiral Andrew Cunningham. Their task was clear: prevent any Axis convoys from reinforcing the German landings with troops or heavy weapons by sea. Over the next few days, a tense cat-and-mouse game played out across the narrow straits between Crete and the Greek mainland. Axis convoys tried to slip through under cover of darkness. British destroyers and cruisers patrolled relentlessly to intercept them. But with every hour, the balance of power tilted toward the Luftwaffe. By May 22nd, the situation reached a boiling point. 3 separate British naval groups, Forces A, 1, B, and C, found themselves stretched across the waters north and west of Crete. They had already inflicted heavy damage on German convoys the night before. Rear Admiral Irvine Glennie's force had sunk 8 German transport ships, scattering nearly 2,000 mountain troops into the sea. It was a textbook night raid, but the price of staying near Crete during daylight would prove devastating. By sunrise, hundreds of aircraft, over 700 Axis warplanes, including dive bombers, level bombers, and fighters roared into action from airfields across mainland Greece. Among them was General Wolfram von Richthofen's vaunted 8 Fliegerkorps, which included 268 of the infamous Junkers Ju 87 Stuka dive bombers, each designed to rip open ships with surgical precision. At 7:00 a.m., the first British ships were spotted. Rear Admiral Edward King, leading a cruiser force to the west of the island, was pushing forward to intercept a second convoy, unaware he was sailing into a trap set in the clouds. By 8:30, his cruisers engaged the convoy, but were swarmed by Luftwaffe bombers that made precise gunnery impossible. After an hour of ineffective engagement, and with Axis aircraft arriving in waves, King ordered a retreat, but the sea offered no safety, and the sky never closed. From the moment Admiral King turned his ships away from the Axis convoy, the tempo of the day escalated into chaos. The Royal Navy had always been trained, drilled, and hardened to fight on the sea against other ships, submarines, and surface threats, but now it found itself fighting an entirely new kind of war, one it was never meant to win. By 10:00 a.m., the air assault on King's force intensified. Between 11:15 and 11, archival. The cruiser, HMS Naiad alone, dodged 36 bombs, each one falling with a deafening whistle and a geyser of spray. Though none struck directly, the concussive force warped her hull plating, flooding an engine room and slowing her to 17 knots. That damage rippled outward, slowing the entire task force. Worse still, the anti-air cruiser HMS Carlisle took a direct hit to her superstructure. The blast killed most of her bridge crew, a crippling blow to her ability to coordinate fire. At this point, King realized the truth. His formation was not just under attack, it was being hunted, isolated, picked apart. He signaled Rear Admiral Bernard Rawlings, requesting him to bring Force A1, which included battleships and heavier cover eastward, to meet them. Rawlings agreed, but to do so, his fleet had to sail directly into the narrow channel between Crete and the Greek mainland, a corridor now swarming with bombers from Richthofen's 8th Air Corps. At 1:22 p.m., King's group came into view of Rawlings's force. It was a grim reunion. The horizon shimmered with explosions and tracer fire as Rawlings' battleships opened up with anti-aircraft batteries, taking some of the pressure off King's battered cruisers. But this mutual defense brought its own horrors. German Me-109 fighters, typically reserved for dogfights, had been converted into light bombers, each carrying a single 250 kilograms bomb. One of these slammed into the side of the battleship HMS Warspite, detonating near her secondary battery and blowing a massive hole through her starboard hull. Fires spread quickly, tearing through interior compartments. It was only early afternoon, and the worst was yet to come. A few minutes later, something subtle but deadly occurred. Rear Admiral King, now reunited with Rawlings, sent a signal that would alter the course of the day. By naval protocol, King held seniority. He had been a rear admiral longer than Rawlings. He invoked this rule and assumed command of the entire force. On paper, this was proper chain of command, but in practice, it was a disaster. King had little tactical awareness of the condition of Rawlings' ships. He had no data on their ammunition levels, no knowledge of their anti-air readiness, and no operational rhythm with their commanders. He was flying blind. Meanwhile, HMS Greyhound, a destroyer sent earlier by Rawlings to sink a stray Axis transport, had completed her task and was now alone, far to the north. King ordered her return at 1:51 p.m. That single order condemned her. Without the cover of the fleet, Greyhound was attacked by 8 Stuka dive bombers. Despite frantic evasive maneuvers by her captain, Commander Walter Marshall, A. Dean, she took 2 direct hits and sank in minutes. King watched from afar as smoke rose from the wreckage and made his next call. He sent 2 destroyers, HMS Kandahar and HMS Kingston, to pick up survivors. Then, critically, he dispatched 2 cruisers, HMS Gloucester and HMS Fiji, to provide anti-air cover for the rescue. This decision would prove catastrophic. King didn't know, but Rawlings did, that both cruisers were almost completely out of anti-aircraft ammunition. Gloucester had just 18% of her AA rounds left. Fiji had barely 30%. To those aboard, the order felt like a death sentence. One officer aboard Gloucester was overheard saying, "This is as if someone said, 'Go back, shoot 100 of your men, drown 120, and sink your ship.' They had no hope of defending themselves, and yet they sailed northward, straight into the maw of the Luftwaffe." At 2:13 p.m., King finally asked Rawlings how much ammunition his cruisers had left. The answer arrived too late. The fleet was now fragmented, a fatal error in a battlefield ruled by the Air Force C, now consisting of Fiji, Gloucester, Kandahar, and Kingston, raced north to rejoin the main fleet as Stuka dive bombers zeroed in. At 3:27 p.m., Gloucester was struck by 2 direct hits. Fires broke out across her decks. Then came near misses, each one tearing at her damaged hull and knocking out gun control systems. Still, she fought on until her ammunition ran out entirely. Then, at 3:45 p.m., 3 more bombs hit her. The ship staggered. Internal explosions tore through her decks. The order came, "Abandon ship," but the lifeboats were shattered. Some floated, most sank. Fiji tried to assist dropping life floats, but could not stay to help. They, too, were vulnerable. No rescue came. Of Gloucester's 815 men, only 85 survived, plucked from the water by Axis vessels and taken prisoner. A single order had cost the Royal Navy one of its finest light cruisers, and the sun was still high above the Aegean Sea. As the afternoon sun bore down on the shattered remnants of Force C, the Aegean waters turned from a battlefield into a graveyard. But the ordeal wasn't over. The cruiser Fiji, now alone with the destroyers Kandahar and Kingston, began to withdraw southeast toward what was hoped to be safety. But in the skies, there was no such thing. By 5:30 p.m., the trio was still within striking range of Axis airfields, and Stukas were not the only threat now. Level bombers, fighters, even reconnaissance aircraft were now retasked as bombers. It was open season on British ships. Fiji, like Gloucester, had expended the last of her anti-aircraft ammunition. Her only remaining defense was speed and maneuverability, but even that was quickly diminishing. At 6:45 p.m., an ME-109 designed as a fighter, now operating as a bomber, made a close pass and released its deadly payload. The near miss caused a blast so violent it buckled her porthole plates, flooding a boiler room and cutting her top speed. Fiji now listed. Her silhouette in the water, visible even from high altitudes, marked her as a wounded prey. Still, she limped onward. At 7:15 p.m., another ME-109 attacked. This time, the hit was direct. A 250 kilograms bomb tore into another boiler room. Fire raged amidships. Black smoke rose into the clear Aegean sky. And then came the killing blow. A Ju-88, sleek and deadly, swooped in for a precision strike. It released 2 bombs. Both found their mark. It was nearly 8:00 p.m. when the order came, abandon ship. Within 10 minutes, Fiji was gone. The sea once again became the only refuge, cold, uncertain, and filled with oil, debris, and the wounded But this time, rescue did come. Kandahar and Kingston. Defying the risk of renewed air attack, stay behind in the dark, pulling survivors from the water. Among the crew of Fiji was a familiar face, Commander Walter Marshall, a Dean, the same man who had captained the Greyhound earlier that day. He was seen helping other men aboard, steadying them, lifting them with oil-covered arms. When one sailor began to slip beneath the waterline, a Dean jumped in without hesitation. He was never seen again. By the time the destroyers departed at 10:45 p.m., 523 of Fiji's 780 men had been rescued. It was a rare sliver of light on a day otherwise drenched in blood and failure. But when dawn rose on May 23rd, the Mediterranean fleet was forever changed. Let us take measure of the toll. In a single day, the Royal Navy lost 3 ships, HMS Greyhound, HMS Gloucester, and HMS Fiji. A 4th, HMS York, had already been scuttled earlier that month in Suda Bay. Hundreds of trained sailors and officers had perished, many needlessly. Ammunition, morale, and operational cohesion were shattered. Worse still, the Luftwaffe had exposed a truth. The British Admiralty had long refused to accept that ships, even warships, could no longer rule the seas without air cover. For centuries, navies fought each other. The ship-to-ship duel defined maritime warfare, but in the skies above Crete, that paradigm had ended. Dive bombers, level bombers, even converted fighters had shattered some of the Royal Navy's finest vessels, not with torpedoes, but with precision-placed bombs and relentless waves of harassment. The lesson was brutal and undeniable. And yet, in London, it was controversial. There were some who still blamed the commanders on scene. Others questioned the intelligence that had failed to predict the scale of Axis air deployment. But for many inside the Royal Navy, the reckoning had begun. A new understanding dawned. Painfully, air superiority wasn't just something you supported on land. It was essential to survival even at sea. This realization would shape naval doctrine for the rest of the war. The role of aircraft carriers, previously seen as auxiliary to battleships, now surged to the forefront. Fighter protection from sea-based planes would soon become standard. The days of unescorted fleets operating beneath hostile skies were numbered, and yet, for those who served off the coast of Crete, none of these lessons mattered in the moment. What they remembered was the sound not of guns, but of sirens, the howling dive of a Stuka falling from the sky, the endless thump of bombs landing in the sea, the cries in the water, the way the decks tilted under their feet before splitting apart. There was no glory, only fire and silence. By the close of May 22nd, the Mediterranean fleet was bleeding. The losses had been severe, the morale worse. In the coming days, the fleet will be asked to do the impossible once more, to return to Crete again and again, not to fight, but to evacuate. As German paratroopers overran the island, the Royal Navy became the last lifeline for tens of thousands of Allied soldiers trapped ashore. They would come back under fire. They would lose more ships, more lives, but they would come, and in their wake, the Aegean Sea, once a cradle of civilization, would be littered with the twisted bones of modern war. But the final bitter irony of May 1941 was this: Germany would never again mount a major airborne invasion. Despite the success of Operation Mercury, Hitler had been deeply disturbed by the heavy casualties among his elite paratroopers. Over 4,000 Fallschirmjäger were killed or wounded taking Crete. The cost was too high, the prize too small, so the Wehrmacht shifted strategy. No more mass air landings. No more seaborne adventures in the Mediterranean. Crete would be the last of its kind, the first and final airborne island assault of the war. The Allies, however, paid closer attention. They took note of the Luftwaffe's effectiveness, of the need for total air superiority before any amphibious landing. These lessons would shape the planning of future operations from Operation Torch in North Africa to Day in Normandy. But one question still lingers. Quietly, like smoke on the sea, was the destruction of Force C a tragedy of misjudgment, or the unavoidable death cry of an obsolete doctrine? Was Admiral King wrong to take command that day? Or was he simply facing an enemy that had changed the rules of war? The truth may lie somewhere in between, buried beneath the waves off Crete, among the hulls of the Fiji, the Gloucester, and the Greyhound. No monument stands for them on the island. They died trying to defend. No grave marks the exact spots where they went down, but their legacy is not lost. It lives in the doctrine of modern navies, in the radar-controlled missile systems of today's destroyers, in the steel decks of aircraft carriers that now sail with full fighter cover, aware that no gun alone can protect a ship from the sky, and in the whispered memories of a single day when the sun rose on proud cruisers and set on burning steel. The sea had once been Britain's empire, but on May 22nd, 1941, the sky became her reckoning.